co-hosting with me. And of course, Jane Oneail presenting. So we're giving everybody just a minute or two to sort of roll in. I hope that's okay with everybody. And we'll get started just in a few minutes. So thanks for your patience. I usually ask people to mute themselves. It sort of cuts down on the barking dogs and the clanging dishes in the background. So if everybody can easily mute themselves, that's terrific. You can certainly stay on video if you like, or if you feel uncomfortable, you can mute that off also, whatever works best for you. So we're expecting a fairly large group today. So thanks again for your patience. We are going to be recording this, so we will be putting it up on the website for the Rockport Library right on our YouTube channel. So look for that in the next few days. You could certainly watch it again. I found myself to do that with a lot of Jane's programs. She tends to go rapid fire, and I was like, oh, did I miss something on that? And sometimes I'll circle back and go back and look at that. So, so if you're anything like me, you need to look at them a couple of times often. So I'm mindful of the time, so I think we'll get started, and people just may be rolling in anyway. So thank you again all for joining. As I said, I'm Dana Mastriani, the Assistant Director at the Rockport Library, and we've got Marnie Smith also co-hosting with us today on this beautiful Sunday afternoon here. Jane Oneail is going to be presenting Botticelli. Before we get going, if everybody could just mute themselves, if you're not already muted, that would be great. In terms of questions, if you have any questions, Jane always likes to do her program and then take her questions at the end. So if you could keep them to the end, that would be terrific. If you're anything like me and you may forget your question in the next 60 minutes, feel free to put it in the chat. And what we can do is just serve them up to Jane at the end. As noted, we will be recording this and making the recording available. And Marnie will be putting in the chat our next meeting with Jane at Culturally Curious, which will be on October 16th, Off with Their Heads, which is the art of the French Revolution. So just a little introduction today for everybody. Botticelli, Beauty, Virtue, and Bonfire of the Vanities. Sandro Botticelli was a leading artist of the early Italian Renaissance with a distinctive linear style. This program will focus on how his explorations of beauty and myth dramatically shift after the rise of the religious leader Savonarola and his Bonfire of the Vanities. I'm sure I've made a mess of his name. About Jane Oneail, our lovely presenter, she was leading tours at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston when she first began to appreciate the special magic that happens when people look at art together and share their genuine reactions and questions. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She was born and raised in New Hampshire and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Women Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. She's taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. So I will be turning this now over to Jane. And once again, we appreciate everybody joining. Have a great day, everybody, and sit back and enjoy.
All right, thank you so much, Dana. And thank you to everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Botticelli. You will not be disappointed. We are essentially traveling to Italy in the next hour without the cost of a flight or the risk of COVID. So we are going to be reveling in the beautiful work of this early Renaissance master and considering really what makes it unusual, exceptional, confounding, and enduring after all of these years. And we'll look at and think about how and why Botticelli's work changes after this religious upheaval that's associated with the Bonfire of the Vanities. So there's always a lot to cover. If you've never been to one of these programs before, I tend to talk fast and we look at a lot of images. So hopefully I'll keep your attention over the next hour. Let me give you a sense of how we'll move through the material. We will, of course, be looking at that beautiful face that we started with, but just to give you a sense in terms of how the next hour will be organized, we're going to start off with a quick review of the life and times of Sandro Botticelli. We'll turn our attention to some of his early religious works, and surprise, he has paintings at the Sistine Chapel, in addition to Michelangelo. And then this next section is called Beauty and Virtue, but I really should have just named it Blonde Bombshells, because that's what he becomes probably best known for painting. And then the revolt against that really is the Bonfire of the Vanities, and we'll finish up with his legacy. We've got a few more of these blonde bombshells over here. This is a detail from one of the works that we'll be looking at today. So let's get started with the life and times of Sandro Botticelli. This is believed to be a self-portrait of the artist right over here. It's just a small detail in a much larger religious painting. This is like a nativity scene, the gift of the Magi. All of these onlookers here would have been contemporary people to Botticelli, people who paid for the painting, essentially. So who was Botticelli? Well, his real name was Alessandro di Mariano Filippi, great name, but I guess adopted the nickname Botticelli. There's a couple of different reasons or theories as to why. It essentially means in Italian, little barrel. And apparently, according to one scholar, that was his brother's nickname. Maybe his brother was small and stout, and Botticelli took it on as his own. Another researcher thinks that Botticelli apprenticed under a goldsmith and took his master's name. Now, Botticelli was born around 1444. We're not entirely sure, but we do know that he died in 1510. So he was about 65 years old when he died. He was an Italian painter from Florence, and he, in addition to painting, he was an illustrator, he was an engraver, and he's really noted for these, these graceful figures and this linear style, this kind of hard edge style, this black outline to everything, which serves as a really nice transition. It sort of tees things up for Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci in the 16th century. Now, here in this purported self-portrait, Botticelli would have been about 30 years old when he painted it, and his career was taking off. So there's a lot of self-confidence, I think, when we look at this face here. Now, Botticelli never married, and he never moved out of essentially the home that he was born in. He lived with his family his entire life, never really traveled unless it was for work. So even though we don't know exactly when he was born, it's safe to say that he was born at the right time. We are looking at an aerial or bird's eye view of Florence that was not created by Botticelli, but created during his lifetime. And this is a good reminder for, the fact that Florence was small, but it was densely packed. And it was this hub of intellectual thinking. This was really kind of the birthplace of the Italian Renaissance, where we have this artistic, humanistic, scientific rebirth, this flowering of intellectual curiosity. And here's Botticelli right in the midst of it. What a lucky time to be alive. It's like living in Silicon Valley, just as the tech bubble is beginning to blow up. So what is happening because of the Renaissance and this rebirth? Well, there's this renewed interest in the classical world. What is actually physically happening is that Italians are digging up, they're excavating their past. And so you have these images, these are actually both from the early 1500s, that show us that Italians were unearthing sculptural fragments, torsos and bodies and sarcophagi that were created 15 to 2000 years earlier. These were created in the ancient world, and they were inspiration for a whole new visual vocabulary for the Italians living around Botticelli's lifetime. So not only were they excavating them, but they were collecting them, they were studying them, and that also changed the way that Italians were even thinking about the architecture and the monuments that surrounded them, because they were still living in and amongst these major monuments from the classical past. This is the Arch of Titus over here. This is the Arch of Constantine. And I bring in these two images of monuments from Rome just to show you that over the years, they weren't always well preserved, first of all, and they didn't stand in splendid isolation like we think of them today. They were built up around, they were used for other things. You can see in this painting here, there's like, trees growing off of it. The Arch of Titus is sort of breaking down over here. But today, when you visit Rome, these are kind of perfectly preserved monuments, and you don't think anybody ever used them differently for the entire, since they were initially built. But it's really only during Botticelli's lifetime that that Italians are looking at these things with new eyes and new appreciation. Now, Botticelli was formally trained by an artist named Fra Filippo Lippi. That's like my favorite name of all time. This is a self-portrait of Fra Filippo Lippi. And it's good to remember that many artists who are working in this era of the early Italian Renaissance, that they were friars, they were priests themselves, like Fra Filippo Lippi. And that meant that they really knew the stories of the church. They knew what was important to communicate. Their biblical knowledge served their artistic knowledge, and it was a continual circle really there. Fra Filippo Lippi did not act like a priest in any way. He actually sort of famously ran off with a nun, impregnated her, and their illegitimate child ended up becoming a student of Botticelli. So another kind of circle there. But Botticelli studied under him. He learned a number of great things like linear perspective, obviously this linear style of painting as well with that hard edge outline. But I wanted to give you an example of Fra Filippo Lippi's painting, which I think will help to inform our understanding of these blonde bombshells that Botticelli paints a little bit later on. So this is an example of Lippi's work over here. This is the Madonna and Child with two angels. It's at the Uffizi. It's painted in 1465. And it's really just a stunning example of painting. The Madonna is absolutely gorgeous. She's blonde. She's got this sort of diaphanous veil that trails over her shoulders here. She emerges into our space past the painted frame of this picture. And this angel who's kind of propping up the Christ child invites us in as well. It seems to make eye contact with us. It's an intimate devotional image. And we'll see how this kind of painting really sets the stage for Botticelli's work just a few decades later. So all good things to come here. Okay, let's turn our attention to Botticelli's real first masterwork after he came out from underneath Fra Filippo Lippi. And this is a work called Fortitude. It was part of a series of large paintings of virtues, allegorical virtues, female figures who are kind of standing in as the virtue. And Botticelli's role was just to paint this one virtue, fortitude in this case. So the year is 1470. Things are alive and really happening in Florence, and he gets this great commission for a work that's going to be in a public place. So let's see how he tackles this. How is his imagining of fortitude informed by how he was trained and what was around him? Well, first and foremost, as you look at this figure, does she seem particularly strong to you? Not to me. There's something about this downward, sideways glance that seems like resignation, not necessarily fortitude, but it seems as though she's seen some things and maybe she's weathered a storm. We have this interesting play of like this fierceness with the armor on, but also this softness with this red cape that's draped around her as well. The first thing I notice about her is that she is sitting in this elaborate architecture on this throne, and she has this very long torso and sort of a short lap in comparison. And it reminds me so distinctly of religious precedents that came before it and came before Botticelli. This is a famous altarpiece painted by the Italian master Master Duccio from roughly 100 years earlier. Notice how the Madonna's throne here projects out into our space in almost the exact same composition that we see over here with Botticelli's work. We've got a Madonna that serves as a throne for the Christ child here. Her head is also down, her face is sort of downcast in the same way. Long torso, short lap, but instead of a baby here, we have a scepter. So we see Botticelli sort of, picking from his bag of tricks already, and being able to swap out religious themes for alternative themes. We'll see this throughout his career. It's a big idea. Now, we're not going to focus too much. I quickly wanted to show you the detail of the armor here, just the reminder that he did apprentice with a goldsmith, so he certainly has an appreciation for how things should glitter and shine and sparkle to our eye. Now, as we sort of finish up an examination of Botticelli's life, I wanted to share with you, this is just such a great painting. It was done in 1922 by a British artist named Eleanor Brookdale. She's considered to be a pre-Raphaelite artist. This is her imagined vision of Botticelli in his studio. And in this scene, there are two gentlemen walking into his studio who happen to be the Medici brothers. And we're not going to talk too much about patronage tonight, but it is important to know that Lorenzo de' Medici was a major player in Florence at the time. The Medici family was. They started off as bankers, and then their influence spread through the arts and through other means. But Lorenzo de' Medici was a humanist himself. He was a scholar, he was a poet, and he took apparently he took a real interest in Botticelli. He kind of took him under his wing. Botticelli became his favorite artist until apparently Michelangelo became his favorite artist. So Lorenzo de' Medici had great taste and a lot of influence. So once you have a patron like this, your reputation, your finances, your future is secured. And of course, we know that is true for young Botticelli. So we'll finish up this introduction to the life and times of Sandro Botticelli with just the quick note that almost all of his works that we'll be seeing tonight are housed in this one institution called the Uffizi. If you've been to Florence before, there's no doubt in my mind that you've visited the Uffizi. It is this amazing repository of Italian painting, and they hold dozens of Botticelli's paintings. It's amazing to think that this man who lived hundreds of years ago and really never left the town, his entire legacy is preserved, essentially, a stone's throw away. So we're getting our virtual tour of the Uffizi today. All right, so let's turn our attention to some of his early religious works and take a quick tour of the Sistine Chapel along the way. So we already know that, that Botticelli is coming from the school of painting where he's been trained by an artistic priest. He's working in service of the church. So of course, a lot of his paintings are going to be about religious figures. And so he kind of develops this specialization in images like this, which are called Sacra Conversazione. Oh, my Italian's awful. Conversazione. I'm just going to call it sacred conversation to spare you. And a sacred conversation is when you imagine a gathering of divine figures, and they almost seem to be swapping stories in a scene like this, having a sacred conversation. Oftentimes, patrons or patron saints are included in scenes like this as well. So almost always the setup for a scene like this is to have Mary and the Christ child right at the center, right at the forefront. Oftentimes they're up on a pedestal or a throne like we see here. In this case, we've got this wonderful linear perspective. They look like they're in a realistic, rational space, a space that we could sort of step into, and a space that also reinforces the primacy of the Virgin and child here. So she's got a halo on, but even the architecture sort of reinforces that as well. We've got Mary Magdalene, we've got John the Baptist, St. Francis Assisi, and St. Catherine over here. These patron saints relate actually to the Medici family, so we won't touch upon that too much, but we already see some familiar elements here. The Virgin is so much like the figure of fortitude. Her head is downcast, and she's she's got that very long torso to function as a throne for the Christ child here. Now, within the space of just a few years, I should mention that this painting was done in 1470. It's roughly 5 feet by 6 feet, and almost all of the paintings we'll be seeing from Botticelli are tempera paintings. Almost all of them, like I said too, are at the Uffizi. But within the space of a few years, we can see these sacred conversation paintings get even more elegant, even more elaborate. We've gone from just a few saints to a number more, and then these winged angels. The architecture in the space is even more elaborate. Look at how there's like this projecting element around the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, who of course are front and center still, now up several flights, several steps here to once again reinforce their centrality to Christianity. So the Virgin Mary has this very thin, delicate halo around her head, but notice how that's reinforced with this scallop shell dome above her. So everything is getting punched up a little bit. The elegance, the sort of elaborate gestures here, the way that the figures are interacting with each other. I want to draw your attention to John the Baptist here. John the Baptist is almost always depicted wearing like animal skins like this, but look at how long his neck is, how exaggerated his face is, and then even this long arm over here. Botticelli's going to do a lot of storytelling with gestures and poses, but that is a particularly elongated arm. There's a real distortion there, and we begin to see these little distortions throughout. He tends to give women, virgins and Venuses, very long giraffe-like necks that sort of are hinged in an interesting way. So one last sacred conversation I wanted to share with you. This one is later, but it also shows that he doesn't always have to have a huge bevy of figures, that he can do some really impressive work on a smaller scale, but he finds other ways to show off. So in this case, we only have two saints flanking the Madonna and Child. The Madonna is feeding the Child, but they're not outside. It's not a chance really to use linear perspective other than on the throne here. So Botticelli is going all in on nature and the different kinds of plants that would form these quasi-architectural arches over the each of these figures to accentuate once again the nature of their composition and the primacy of the Virgin and Child here, but to almost suggest the additional halos alongside them too. So in addition to the plants up above, notice too there's this greenery down below at their feet that it is highly detailed. There's all different kinds of plant life here, and we'll see an extension of that interest in the natural world a little bit later on. So just very quickly, bear with me, there's just a few last religious paintings that I wanted to share with you. I've always been a fan of Annunciation scenes. I love to see how male artists would imagine a woman being told that she is divinely pregnant and carrying the Son of God. So in this case, this Annunciation scene, what we're looking at is actually a fresco painting. So Botticelli could do tempera and fresco. Fresco is when an artist paints directly into wet plaster, so their painting becomes a permanent part of the wall. The colors tend to be a little bit muted, a little bit more muted when it's a fresco painting. And this is on a large scale. It's roughly 20 feet long. So in this fresco, the angel Gabriel, who's the messenger of God, comes in to share this news with Mary: you are pregnant. And notice how he's kind of swooping in. He is hovering above the ground here. And he has his arms crossed over his chest. And we can see that this message is coming from God, coming from behind him, but it seems to come through him as well in these straight golden rays of light that extend all the way to Mary. She's receiving this gesture, looks almost as though she's about to cross her arms in the same way across her chest. But I think this is a brilliant composition because it almost looks as though she's holding an invisible child there. Now there's a ton to talk about here, but I wanted to show you one last Annunciation Annunciation scene, and this is probably Botticelli's most famous Annunciation scene. This was done right around 1490, and he's really at the peak of his career. He can do so much at this point. This is a tempera painting, so the colors are a little bit more vivid, but he's kind of restricted the color palette here, and he has eliminated anything that's unnecessary. This is a much smaller painting. It's roughly 5 feet by 5 feet. Instead of the angel Gabriel hovering in the air, he's crouching on the ground with his hand uplifted. And now there aren't any golden rays of light. It's almost as though the message is coming through his arm, coming through those fingertips here, because the Virgin isn't crossing her arms either, isn't cradling an invisible baby. Instead, she's reaching out, and it's almost as though we have this message traveling between their fingers. He's giving and she's receiving. And it's almost as though the architecture just behind them is kind of reinforcing the travel of that, reinforcing how that message is traveling from one hand to the next. Every time I see this, I get so excited because it reminds me of Michelangelo and that detail from the Sistine Chapel ceiling of, Adam and God, the creation of man, storytelling that is really all about gestures and poses. And Botticelli was doing this decades before Michelangelo ever showed up in Rome. So he's got a real good sense in terms of making his figure seem really human, tackling subjects that can show their humanity. So Michelangelo here is a good segue for us to move over to the Sistine Chapel, because that is exactly what Botticelli does. In 1481, he's called there by the Pope, along with several other leading early Italian Renaissance artists. This is the Pope over here, by the way. And at this point, Michelangelo wasn't even there. He's a child still at this point. The ceiling is just a night sky with stars in it. And this Pope hires these early Renaissance artists to paint this upper story of the Sistine Chapel, fill it with these stories of Christ's life and of Moses's life. And these are major paintings. They're all frescoes. They're roughly 13 feet high and 20 feet long. And yes, they are still there today, but nobody cares about them. When you go to the Sistine Chapel, you really go to see Michelangelo. Nobody is even aware that there are several Botticellis in the room, and there are. So I just very quickly wanted to show you a few of them, just to show how remarkably he's doing at this young age, at this early stage of his career. So in this picture, which is called The Temptations of Christ, we have more than 50 figures painted in this scene. I mean, this would be a major undertaking for any artist, and this isn't all. So he's in this image, he's doing some really interesting storytelling, and his approach to storytelling, you'll see, is sort of remains consistent throughout his whole career. He tends to tell stories, multiple scenes from a single story, in one frame. So it's not like a modern day cartoon where you might put it in the next panel. For Botticelli, he always tells all the stories in one panel. So there are 3 different stories here about Christ being tempted, but that just means that there are 3 Christs here. On the main stage down below, there is a leper who has been healed, and there is a priest here who is about to do a ritualistic cleansing for him. So all these other figures are probably people within the church who might have even paid to have their portraits included here. So interesting storytelling, some elaborate Renaissance style architecture here. Now, just across from the Temptations of Christ is another panel with scenes from the life of Moses. And I won't get into all of the storytelling, but you can probably make out that Moses is repeated again and again and again. He's got these golden robes and usually some green on top of it as well. So it's that same kind of storytelling. And what he's doing here by drawing this association between Moses and Christ, he's drawn an association really between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And by doing so, by reinforcing the New Testament, it reminds everybody that Christ gave the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter, and St. Peter became the first pope. So all of these paintings are really about instilling this legitimacy in the Pope, and really his client in this case. So it's elaborate storytelling, to say the least. One quick look at the last panel that he did at the Sistine Chapel. I won't even get into the story here, but I wanted to share with you that that he includes some of the major classical monuments that he was seeing while he was there in Rome. This is the Arch of Constantine, playing this sort of anchoring role in this story, giving us a sense of space, giving us a sense of time. And this is a monument that he'll go back to even at the end of his career. Here's just a view of the Arch of Constantine, if you're not familiar. So what we're going to do now is shift gears and turn our attention to the blonde ambition and get reminded too about the important link to virtue when it comes to these beautiful women that Botticelli became known for painting. Now, it doesn't seem revolutionary, right? Of course, his master was already painting beautiful blonde Madonnas. Doesn't seem like a stretch that he would be doing the same thing. Well, these works are a little bit different, but what unites them is this idea of this notion of beauty being equated to virtue. It was an easy kind of shorthand for artists to show how good somebody was, how divine somebody was, how important somebody was, by showing them as being beautiful. And that notion, that idea, gets exaggerated by the time it gets to Botticelli. So in order to show that Madonna is good, that the Madonna is chaste and all these other wonderful things, you can't just show her as a beautiful woman. You have to do the 15th century version of Photoshop on her. You have to make her an otherworldly beauty. She has to look like somebody almost that you would never see in real life. So we've gone from like the prettiest girl in school essentially to like an overworked like Snapchat filter in some ways. She doesn't look real, but she is beautiful and elegant and elongated here. So we've got a lot of gold, we've got a lot of blonde hair. We're going to be talking about the importance of the blonde hair. We've got a lot of these diaphanous veils. Look at how ornate that halo is here. Now, Botticelli does so many of these devotional sort of half-length portraits of the Madonna, and they all get amped up in terms of how beautiful she is. It's sort of like how magazines at the checkout aisle, they always feature women that are so gorgeous. They're designed to grab your attention so that you'll grab the magazine. That's what he was doing. Now, I could show you hours of these beautiful Madonnas, but we're going to skip to the mother of them all. And this is, pun intended, this is his painting called the Madonna of the Magnificat. This is from 1841. So he painted this the same year he's doing the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And this is a round tondo format. I believe it's probably about 4 feet tall, the actual painting itself. He tends to paint things just under life size. There are several figures here along with the Madonna and Child that are members of the Medici family, big surprise. But this is a painting of a woman that is an otherworldly beauty, a supernatural beauty. There's just a little bit of pink in her cheeks and on her lips. Her skin is flawless. Her proportions are idealized. Her hair is literally gold. This is what you get when you apprentice with the goldsmith. This crown that they're about to give her is real gold again, and it's just delicate and beautiful, crowning her the Queen of Heaven. So it's all these little stars. Notice that she has multiple diaphanous veils on her head, in addition to this gorgeous pink and blue scarf that's sort of like twisted around her head and her shoulders. She is as lovely could be. I could would certainly live with this woman and pray to this woman every day. In this scene, she is writing the hymn, the Magnificat. And I love the detail here that like the little baby Christ child is kind of guiding her hand, letting her know what to write here. So if we just glance back to Eleanor Brickdale's painting of Botticelli in his studio, notice that she included this painting here as like the emblem of how great Botticelli's work is. Now it's important to go back to this picture too, because there is this beautiful blonde woman who is entering Botticelli's studio in this moment. This is an imagined meeting, but we do know that Botticelli met at some point this beautiful woman named Simonetta Vespucci. And art historians ever since have been debating in terms of what the nature of their relationship was and how often she modeled for Botticelli, because you'll notice in this case, she is being introduced to him by way of the Medicis, and even the Medicis referred to her as the unparalleled one. She was with the indisputed beauty of her time, really. And that last name Vespucci, she was a relative by marriage to Amerigo Vespucci, who of course is the explorer for whom America is named. So Simonetta Vespucci apparently inspired a great deal of the beautiful blondes that Botticelli painted. And with these two paintings, the attribution is still a little fuzzy. There's not every art historian would say that these are portraits of Simonetta. She died actually at a very young age, but there is a similarity there, a likeness. Perhaps sketches of her might have inspired these works, or perhaps it was her herself, and maybe these are earlier works. But I wanted to show you these particular works to emphasize some of the elements here that make Botticelli's paintings so impressive, make them show that they are something more than the Madonnas that we saw before. First and foremost, you'll notice the beautiful faces, the elegant proportions, the lovely features here. But these pictures, whenever I look at them, they're really about the hairstyles, right? These are women who were professionally styled for these sittings, because I've never seen hairdos like this in my life. And hair, during this time in the Renaissance, women's hair was considered like a sort of a polite way to show just how sensual they were. It was like a sign of like female virility in some way to have a lot of hair. In fact, during this time in the Renaissance, they thought that hair inflames desire. So the more elaborate your hairstyle could be, the more adornment you could have, really accentuated just how lovely and sensual you were. In fact, there were laws at the time that women of lower classes couldn't adorn their hair as much as the women from the upper classes. Now, if you don't believe me, notice that this woman over here on the left has these two braids that terminate down just between her breasts. So everything goes back to this kind of unbelievable sensuality with the hair. And that might be a nice segue into this next sort of unusual tangent in Botticelli's career, because we've seen him do religious paintings, we've seen a portrait or two maybe, but then he takes this kind of left turn and he does some revolutionary work that's not religious. It is instead mythological. And this is highly unusual for the time. And these paintings are so strange, they're so outside of the norm that art historians still debate to this day what these paintings are all about. And they are large paintings. They're both at the Uffizi, the two that I'm going to show you. This is from 1482, so Botticelli is in his prime, really. And this is tempera on panel. It's 6.5 feet tall by 10 feet wide. And this is known as Primavera, or the allegory of spring. There's a lot of debate about what's happening here. A lot of ink has been spilled over this, but it's generally thought that we are looking at a depiction of Venus here, the goddess of love and beauty. And and all of these other figures are included to sort of spell out associations with springtime, fertility, and love. So I'm going to walk you through this and help you make sense in terms of what Botticelli's doing. But just as he kind of dipped back into religious painting to inform his allegory of fortitude, Botticelli is going to sort of borrow from religious motifs in order to tell the story of springtime here too. So even though we're looking at a Venus here and not a Virgin, you'll notice that he's using the same technique in terms of creating a sort of quasi-architectural niche out of these green elements, out of nature. He's doing that over here. And instead of putting the Christ child anywhere in this picture, because we've got the Venus, he includes the Venus's son, who is Cupid or Eros, and he's not in her arms, he's flying up above her. So it's really just taking a few of the things that he's already familiar with and changing it around a little bit. Notice too how his Venus here has this flexed wrist. So he's found a few gestures that he really likes, and he begins to include them in other scenes. In this case, she doesn't necessarily seem to be receiving a message as so much as like sort of blessing what's going on in front of her. So let's take this all in. We've seen some of the influences so far. What is happening here? We've got all of these figures that almost look spotlit against this kind of dark background. Now, this background has definitely darkened since Botticelli painted it. These figures are in an orange grove. Oranges are the symbols of the Medici family. Medici means medicine. Oranges were prized for like their medicinal value, so they're the symbol of the family. And then down below, there are all of these flowers. In fact, art historians have been able to definitively identify more than 130 different species of flowers on the floor of this forest that he's painted here. Now, like I said, it's all darkened over time, but these spotlit figures don't have shadows. They sort of seem like figures on a stage telling us some sort of story. So let's figure out the story here. We're going to start over here on the right. There are three figures here, and art historians sort of understand them as being related to each other. So we'll start off on the edge. There is this figure with blue skin and big puffed up cheeks and wings, who is flying through the air with this drapery around him. And he seems very fixated on this sort of nymph-like woman who is nearly nude. She's got this diaphanous drapery, this see-through drapery around her, but she looks like she's running away. She almost looks fearful. She's lunging forward, and he has grabbed her. So art historians generally agree that he is like a Zephyr character. He's a god of wind. So his cheeks are all puffed up because he's about to blow seeds around. It's springtime. He's about to pollinate things. And she is a nymph named Chloris. And the second he grabs her, the second he attains her, that wind that he is pollinates, and this plant sort of sprouts from her mouth. And then most art historians agree that she becomes this goddess of Flora over here. She is the symbol, the allegorical figure that represents flowers in springtime. So she's wearing this beautiful dress, and instead of running away in fear, she's striding forward confidently, sort of spreading blossoms around as she moves. All right, so if we move to the other side of the painting, we've got four figures over here now. These are understood to be the three virtues, and they are chastity, pleasure, and beauty. They are idealized blonde, basically nudes. Again, they're all wearing see-through drapery here. Maybe there's a Simonetta Vespucci in there, you could debate it, but they've got the beautiful hair, the elaborate updos, and they're all sort of dancing together in these poses that sort of give and receive equally. They seem to be unaware of everybody else in this forest, but look over here, that little Cupid that is up above the Venus, he's blindfolded and he is pointing his arrow at one of these women. So once they get struck, one of them will then fall in love. Who will the lucky man be? It could be Mercury over here. He is the messenger to the gods, but he's also He is the Roman god of the month of May. So he's the perfect character to have in a painting about springtime. He is using his little staff here to stir up the clouds up above his head. So on one side of the picture, we have a zephyr, the wind coming in. On the other side, we have it being punctuated again by weather, and this notion of the wind moving seeds around and pollinating things. Love is coming to fruition. All of this is told with these beautiful idealized women. So Botticelli is treading in an entirely new category of painting, completely new to the Italian Renaissance. This and the picture we just saw are pictures that are about pleasure. They are about sex. So we are looking at, of course, The Birth of Venus. This is without a doubt his most famous painting from 1485. It's also at the Uffizi. It's on canvas. It's 5.5 feet wide, or 5.5 feet tall and 9 feet wide. So we've got another beautiful blonde bombshell here, but she's not a virgin. She is still divine because she's Venus once again, but this Venus is completely nude. And this is revolutionary for the time because artists had not painted female nudes since classical antiquity, unless it was Eve, and Eve was ashamed of her nudity. This is a Venus who is, you know, a little bit modest, but not necessarily cowering in shame. So we know that Venus was born of sea foam, and in this moment that Botticelli is showing us, she is being blown ashore. She's riding this giant scallop shell to the shoreline where she's going to be clothed. We're going to sort of unpack all of this. Now, once again, this is a major painting that was probably done to commemorate a wedding, to honor a wedding or celebrate a wedding of some distant Medici family member. So themes of love, themes of sex, pleasure, pollination, it all fits right in here. We've got another Zephyr figure who has got big puffed up cheeks and sort of like the angel Gabriel that we saw before, hovering above the ground with this message coming through him. Botticelli's just sort of flipping it around, and now it's a pagan figure who is involved not with the Virgin, but with Venus. He is accompanied by a kind of secondary wind figure who's also winged, and she is holding on to him in a completely anatomically impossible way. Notice her shoulders here, which means her hips would have to be somewhere down here. It doesn't really quite make sense, but they're hovering through the air and they're also blowing roses around. If we go back to this slide, you'll notice that Botticelli just took that scallop shell from above the Virgin over here, flipped it upside down, made it impossibly large, and made it a flotational device for Venus to ride in on. Now, this last figure over here on the right, art historians still debate about who she is. She is sometimes understood to be summer, sometimes understood to be spring. So much involved debate over this, but she is just bringing this floral drapery to Venus to cover her up. So as we look at Venus, we have an opportunity to sort of zero in on her here because she is a fascinating figure. She's got all the hair in the world, doesn't she? She's like beyond the Simonetta Vespucci's, or maybe she's the very embodiment of Simonetta Vespucci, but we notice that some of it's blowing in the wind from that Zephyr figure. Some of it is just sort of curling in on itself, but it is impossibly long. This is hair that actually goes probably to her knees or past it. She's scooped some of it up and she's holding it in front of her pubic area, sort of standing in for pubic hair in some ways. But this figure of Venus is so exaggerated. Her proportions are so elongated that if you spend a little bit of time looking at her, you begin to think this is hardly a person's body. It just doesn't work. Botticelli gave her an impossibly long neck. She's like a giraffe here. And once again, the head is sort of hinged in a really unusual way, but it's a way that he'd been sort of using with a lot of his Madonnas. Her shoulders are just collapsed. They are tiny little shoulders here, tiny breasts, but these big sort of massive arms in comparison that might be a little long as well. Now, the way she is standing, if you were to sort of cut her in half here, it almost seems as though she's upright from her waist up, but from the waist down, it seems as though she's moving forward or almost about to fall forward. This pose of hers with one hand over her breasts, one hand over her pubic area, comes from classical antiquity. This goes back to this idea that everybody in Italy is sort of digging up the past, literally. And the Medicis had this sculpture in their collection, an antique sculpture of a figure of Venus who is in the exact same pose here. And this pose makes a voyeur of us all. We can sort of enjoy the sight of this nude figure. And even though she's attempting to cover herself up, she isn't fully doing so. We can still see everything despite her modesty here. All right, in addition to classical sculpture, maybe a little bit of Gothic sculpture influenced Botticelli for this pose too, because this kind of swoop of the body here, where this foot that's at rest seems to be way off to the side in relationship to the center of her body, that really comes from Gothic Gothic sculpture, particularly ivory sculpture that is already kind of bending to the shape of an ivory tusk. And if you look at the body of this Venus too, her body in so many ways looks like it's a reference to a white marble sculpture or an ivory carving like we see over here. So there's a lot to unpack from this. We've only touched on some of the big ideas, but suffice it to say, what we do know about this painting is that it is about beauty, and it continues to be alluring to this day. Now, in our last few moments, I want to tell you a little bit about the Bonfire of the Vanities and how this changes Botticelli's approach to his work. So we're going to first touch back on what's happening with the Medicis as it relates to Botticelli, because the Medicis, you remember, are his great patrons, but their power in Florence is threatened. In fact, there was an assassination attempt against the Medici brothers. It was successful against Giuliano, but Lorenzo de' Medici managed to escape. This is actually a portrait, a posthumous portrait that Botticelli made of Giuliano Medici, who perished in the assassination. Now, for years, there are like these little revolts, these little uprisings, and eventually the Medicis have to leave Florence in exile. There's a power vacuum. His patron has vanished. So what happens in Florence? What happens to Botticelli? Well, this monk, this religious reformer named Savonarola comes to power, and he is there to condemn the worldliness and the corruption of the city. Savonarola is a fanatic, and he becomes the moral dictator of Florence. He is obsessed with human wickedness. He is somebody who detests pleasure and relaxation. Now, the next few images I'm going to show you are all paintings that were done centuries after Savonarola by sort of second-rate artists who just kind of imagined what his rule is like. But here we see him preaching, and people are really kind of taken by him. And one of the things that he is preaching about is kind of the wickedness of the material world, particularly things like art, nude paintings, music, luxury, jewelry, mirrors, all of these things. He told people to get rid of them, and he would host these bonfires. You can see one represented over here as a relief carving. I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a faint image, but here's Savonarola, and here's everybody bringing in their things. Supposedly, a few Botticelli paintings even made it into these bonfires, and his followers were so devout that they would force the hands of people who were not necessarily followers of Savonarola. You can see him up here preaching, and people taking away the possessions of things from other people that they believe to be wicked and corrupt. So all of this leads to a dark place. Savonarola, at the age of 45, is brought to trial essentially because he had too much power. And and the church and others were really threatened by it. So he was tried for uttering prophecies, for religious error, for sedition, and for falsely claiming to have seen visions. And you can see from this image here, again, not painted by Botticelli, that he was executed. He was hanged from a cross with 2 of his followers and then burned. And this was a public execution right in the center of Florence here. There's no doubt that Botticelli saw it. And there's no doubt that Botticelli's artwork was influenced by Savonarola. Art historians debate to what degree Botticelli followed him, but he certainly reflected the fact that times dramatically changed in Florence during Savonarola's rule and following. And we have a great example of it right in Boston at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. We're going to be zeroing in on this work over here. You can see that it's pretty small in scale compared to some of the other works that we've seen so far. It's roughly the size of one of these Italian wooden chests that were oftentimes wedding gifts. And it's believed that this painting, The Tragedy of Lucretia, which dates roughly to 1500, was also probably a wedding gift. And you'll see that this is a very different kind of wedding gift than, let's say, Primavera, that's all about sex and pollination and fertilization. The Tragedy of Lucretia is an allegory in terms of the way women should behave. So the Tragedy of Lucretia is storytelling in 3 parts, similar to the way that he told stories with paintings in the Sistine Chapel. So Lucretia is in green, and we see her 3 times. The story starts over here. Lucretia is raped by the son of a king, and you can see the dagger over here. She's putting up resistance. Her husband comes home, finds her unconscious over here, and then when she is fully revived, she does what any honorable woman would do. She takes her own life. And so this is Lucretia, and I'm of course being sarcastic when I say that, Lucretia dead at the center of the town with all of these figures here agitating, and they're getting ready to overthrow the king. So with this picture, first of all, can you imagine receiving this as a wedding present, telling us how women should behave? So that has changed. His moral focus has changed, but also his approach to painting. These are tiny figures. They're agitated. They are acidic. Everything about this picture is so different from his major mythological works, but he does retain the Renaissance elements to it. So the Arch of Constantine that we saw back in the Sistine Chapel, he is basically replicating it in this particular painting. There is sort of a sister painting to the Tragedy of Lucretia, and this is the story of Virginia. Very similar painting, very similar story, and was also probably a wedding present. Here we have Virginia, who is in a green dress with a pink cape, and you can see her several times in this painting. It's understood that Virginia was, her honor was violated over here. She's brought before like a judge, essentially, and the judge says that she can be his slave. And then her father rescues her, kidnaps her away, but then in order to save her honor, he kills her. So once again, women are really getting the short end of the stick in Botticelli's later works. But these are works that are all about, faith and honor and matrimony, telling very different lessons than what Botticelli was focusing on earlier. Even his religious paintings really sort of signify that his head is in another place. This is the mystical nativity. I believe this is at the National Gallery in DC, and it's from 1500. And right here alone would sort of be the way most artists approach the subject of the nativity. They probably wouldn't include so many angels. There's like 24 angels in this picture. Some of them are like fighting, some of them are dancing, some of them are contending with these devils that are climbing out of the rocks down below. There is so much happening here. But I think importantly, along the top, Botticelli is citing revelations here. He's thinking about end days. There's a darkness to this. It's certainly so frenetic and acidic compared to the gift of the Magi that we had seen sort of starting off his career. So even his Madonnas change in the last decade or so of his career. This is still a lovely female figure here, but she really pales in comparison to the Madonna of the Magnificat that we saw before. Notice that her proportions, I would say, are more human. She's got sort of a thicker neck here. Her face seems more like the face of somebody that you might see on the street. And there's really kind of a pathos here, pathos. She doesn't seem like the serene Madonna that we've seen all along. So his attachment to beauty has even changed in this last decade. So we'll end our look at Botticelli's body of work with this painting called The Man of Sorrows. This is in a private collection, and images like this of Christ after his crucifixion are typically painted to emphasize his physical suffering on the cross. So we do see, the wounds of the crucifixion through his hands. We see that he's tied up. The crown of thorns here is causing him to bleed. His face is not idealized. There is pain here, although Botticelli can't resist giving him some nice curls. But he has this halo of white angels here that are carrying the instruments of Christ's torture. This is a much darker painting than those beautiful bombshells that we saw before. Now, this seems to really align with what many art historians believe is the way that Botticelli's life ended. And that was this idea that these paintings were out of line with his audience. I've read several times that he died penniless. He was unknown, and that essentially he wasn't producing artwork that was valued towards the end of his life. And it all seems because it was from this kind of religious fanaticism that he was exposed to and really sort of caught up in. So we'll finish up with his legacy. And lucky for him, I mean, interest returned. He might have died broke, but we certainly appreciate his works today. We have artists like René Magritte who borrow elements of Botticelli's work wholesale for some of his paintings around mid-century. We have the Venus being appropriated for coins, for euros, 10-cent euros in Italy. She is an icon of Italy now. And the paintings, these blonde bombshells that Botticelli painted, they are still considered so beautiful today that, I mean, there's still articles out there, how to get Botticelli waves, how to look like a woman that Botticelli painted. And the art market is still really interested in Botticelli's works. So just last year, this fascinating image of a man holding this roundel sold for $92 million. So this is one of the highest prices paid for an early Italian work of art in recent years. So I mean, it shows that his legacy is still very strong today. We even know that climate activists who are really trying to get focus on their message in order to get in the press, they've been gluing themselves to masterworks, including Botticelli's Primavera. As you can see here, the painting was not damaged. They actually just glued themselves to glass. If you feel like you can't get enough Botticelli now, you don't have to go to Italy. You can just go over to Minneapolis because there's going to be a huge show beginning next month in just a couple of weeks where dozens of works from the Uffizi are going to be here in the United States. So we will end with just the simple idea that Botticelli was this critical link between the Gothic past and the full high Renaissance future. And the works that he created are so beautiful still today that we hold them up as like the epitome of beauty. That's how enduring they are. So there's so much to appreciate when it comes to Botticelli. I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments that people might have about the works that we saw today.
So I just want to jump in here for a minute, Jane, and say what a phenomenal program this is, and teasing out all those intricate details about Botticelli. I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, I do see one. The last self-portrait doesn't look anything to his self-portrait in the nativity scene.
Oh, Carmen, maybe I didn't make this clear. Okay, so this is actually not a self-portrait. This is called Man of Sorrow. So it's supposed to be Christ. So not a self-portrait in this case, but you could sort of extrapolate that he was probably feeling this way. Oh, this one over here, sorry, Carbon. This one, not necessarily a self-portrait, it's just called Portrait of a Man. I don't think we know who the identity of this figure. But thank you, because I didn't make that clear. So thanks for asking.
What museum holds the Botticelli art in? Oh,
It's the
hold on.
Uffizi, which is
in Florence. Yeah.
It's such a funny name for an art museum because it means offices. The Uffizi Museum in Florence. So next time you're in Italy, it's a must see. It's like the entire history of Italian painting in one museum, and it's the preeminent museum really in Italy. I mean, it's that in the Vatican. So it's a must see.
So lots of course, comments honoring you and what a great job you've done. Wonderful to see this collection of his paintings and Jane's superb presentation. Jane, about the gold in the paintings, I know you said he worked with a goldsmith, etc. Do we know that that's actual gold, like leafing?
And with the Magnificat, I just scrolled past it, sorry there.
This, yes.
Thing that had more gold than any of them. So it's not just in her hair, obviously it's in the halo, it's in her clothing here. And this was considered such a success during its like contemporary to its creation that 5 copies were made. And I know that there is one at the Louvre and one at the Morgan Library in New York City, if you're dying to see it. I don't know if they all have the same level of gold, but I mean, it's like he really landed on a successful formula with this particular painting. And so gold, I mean, has always been about making something desirable, right? And so it's such a great way to enhance her beauty. So very effective here.
Someone writes, if Jesus was a Jew and Mother Mary was a Jew, should it have been dark hair?
It absolutely should have. And even for Italian women, I mean, most Italian women living during the Renaissance probably had dark hair as well. I'm so happy that question was asked because obviously, these are not like historically accurate renditions of Mary, but in order to get this, like these over the top hairdos and the blonde hair, these women were dyeing their hair. And the really unpleasant detail to this is that they were oftentimes using urine to dye their hair. And you have to suffer to be beautiful, apparently. So Botticelli's beautiful blonde bombshells have a little bit of a scent to them, don't they? I'm glad that was pointed out because, right, there's nothing historically accurate about them.
Another comment, this gentleman says, I always see mountains, water, and other scenes that seem to continue the painting far beyond the principal characters.
That is such a wonderful thing to point out, and I didn't do that at all in the discussion. I've been too focused on the figures. I'm trying to find a good example of that. But you're right. I mean, Botticelli creates a whole like world beyond, and part of this is this Italian Renaissance notion that a painting is no longer just a flat icon, that these artists were with their works of art creating a window into another world. So the perspective had to be just perfect, but they wanted to entertain you beyond the figures in the foreground and like let your eye move out to the, along the waterway here to the castles in the distance. Yes, that was always a part of creating a work of art that you feel like you could step into, or feels like an extension of the space that you're in. I'm glad somebody brought that up.
Can you go back for a minute to the picture that was given as the wedding present, but you had it juxtaposed to one of his other paintings just to contrast?
Was it?
I think it was beyond that.
Okay.
Further ahead, sorry, it's closer to the end. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, like one of his Bonfire of the Vanities
This, and I think you had one next to, yes. One could argue that those paintings to me look like they're painted by 2 different people. Right. I don't know if there's any talk of that. If you take a look at the painting on the right, it's so clinical looking, everything is exact and there's no realness to it. It's almost looks like something from a comic book in a way, right? I know that's extreme, but there's no depth to anything. And on the left, it's so radically different.
Well, you're hitting on a really important issue here. And part of this is because this is a fresco painting, so the colors are going to be muted over time. This is a tempera painting, so that accounts for a little bit. But yeah, I mean, now it's like he's got this really pointed perspective because of Savonarola, because of the Bonfire, the Vanities. I mean, paintings, masterworks were being thrown into Bonfire. So if you're going to paint, you have to paint something that's telling a very strong moral lesson, really, right? So the intensity of the color certainly comes from it's a different medium, but I think these little agitated characters, I mean, something has changed. This is a painting on a huge scale. It's like 13 feet tall. This one is maybe 2.5 or 3. So his storytelling has changed. Everything's really changed. But I agree with you, Dana. They don't even look like they're necessarily made by the same person. Yeah. He changed a lot. I was giving this presentation the other night and somebody chimed in at the end and they were like, it's almost like he joined a cult. And I was like, yeah, he really changed. It's amazing.
Agreed, yes. Someone asks, does he use models for the faces?
That's a good question. He probably did. And I think every art historian wants to connect everything back to Simonetta Vespucci, but he did dozens of portraits during his lifetime too. So he was working with live models, certainly, but a lot of them look really sort of like just so beautiful, like an unworldly, unnatural beauty that they were probably maybe based off of a live model, but idealized, to say the least.
Other questions? I'll jump in with another question since I don't see any. The picture of the two that you have up, is there anything worth mentioning about the side view versus straight on view?
Good question. Actually, this was a really popular form of paint, a really popular style of presentation during this era of the early Renaissance. You'll remember the Mona Lisa with the famous like 3/4 profile view. This is like 2 decades away. So this profile view, it goes back to Italian traditions of profile portraiture that go back to like coins and the way that emperors like Caesar were depicted on Italian coins. So it's a way to imbue a figure with authority, it's a way to speak to their level of power really in society. But this kind of changes after we see the Mona Lisa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is the black, somebody asks, what is the black band under her neck?
I think that this is all wrapped up in her hair. And this goes back to this idea of Botticelli being like a really linear painter too. I mean, this is such an unusual hairstyle. It's around her neck, it's over her head. But we can see, every hard line of this painting. I mean, especially those black bands, I think. And for me, they sort of take away from the realism, from the naturalness of these paintings. This is what Da Vinci is going to sort of do away with when he starts painting works like the Mona Lisa. He eliminates that hard line that we saw with so many of Botticelli's paintings. But I mean, the hard line that defines her nose or her jawline here, everything gets fuzzy and hazy when it comes to Leonardo da Vinci. But the hard line, I mean, that's the way we still draw today. If somebody were to hand you a pencil, you'd probably draw the outline of a face and go from there. But Da Vinci, challenges the way artists really suggest the sculptural nature of somebody's face. And he's just using shading now instead of hard lines like that. But yeah, it takes a little bit away from the realness, from the naturalness of the look.
Somebody writes in, his Venus reminds me of Mogdalini. Am I saying that right? Mogdalini work?
Modigliani. Yes, and you're right on the money, Sally. I think Modigliani was definitely thinking of the Venus with that long neck and the tilted head there for sure. And what's really fascinating to me is with a lot of his idealized devotional Madonnas is that they tend to have asymmetrical eyes. Really, most of the time they're looking down and you don't even notice it. But if you tilt your head to look at this Madonna, she has one eye that slants at a strange angle here. You can see it with the Madonna of the book too as well. Not as dramatically here, but if you just did like an online search for Botticelli's Madonnas, like they all tend to have asymmetrical eyes because they're all looking downward, and he's trying to create this illusion of, I don't know, eyes that go straight across, but it kind of falls apart depending on how you look at it. So I think Modigliani is sort of playing off of that with a lot of his modern works, but he is a great artist to compare to. I should probably put him in the legacy portion of that. So Sally, thank you for mentioning him.
So we've been asked, can you give us a little preview of Off with Their Heads, our next visit with you in October?
Sure. Well, I think to study up for it, I want everybody to watch that great movie about Marie Antoinette that I think it was Sofia Coppola did. We're going to be thinking about the Palace Versailles. We're going to be thinking about Marie Antoinette. We're going to be thinking about the French Revolution. And these are really wild times. And we're going to go from artists that support the monarchy to artists that are supporting, the revolutionaries and everything in between. And art, really kind of takes you through the whole thing. It's so dramatic. It's a really fun program. I'm so excited that I get to do it because I don't think I've done it for more than a year. So this will be a real treat.
Terrific. Well, as always, Jane, everyone is thrilled. And it's been a tremendous, tremendous program and immersion into one of these artists that everybody knows about, but may not have that understanding much like you have. So thank you as always. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in October.
October 16th. We'll see you then.
And thank you, everybody. Marnie has put the registration for the next program in October. If you want to sign up, you can do that by taking a look at the chat. And I will say thank you to everybody for spending their Sunday afternoon with us. And as always, Jane, tipping my hat to you.
You're the best. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jane.